Memorial lecture. Thank you all for coming. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to say a few words about Roger Wilson. I picture here one of his favorite study organisms. So there you go. Roger Wilson was a faculty member in the botany department from 1968 to 1975. He grew up near Dayton and received his bachelor's in education from Ohio Northern University. After that, he taught high school for 4 years in Berea, Ohio, and I've just learned that one of his students from there, Suzanne, a family friend, is in attendance, and she had great things to say about her memory of his teaching in high school. After that, he moved on to do a master's at the University of South Dakota and his doctorate at the University of Oklahoma, where he studied the chemical effects of sunflowers in plant succession under the supervision of Ellen Rice. Roger Wilson taught on Miami's Hamilton campus when he first joined the faculty, and then moved on to teach in the Oxford campus. And he continued to do this research on chemical effects in plant ecology. He was very well regarded as an advisor and a teacher, and well liked by his colleagues, graduate students, and undergraduate students. Roger Wilson was known as someone who always made time for his students and had a positive impact on the lives of those that he worked with. His contributions to the botany curriculum included improving existing courses and creating new ones. And at the university level, he made contributions that included participating in the creation of the Institute for Environmental Sciences, and also initiating tallgrass prairie restoration experiments in Pebble Park and the ERC. Roger Wilson's life ended tragically in an automobile accident in May 1975. After his death, his family, friends, and colleagues established the Roger Wilson Lecture Fund in his memory. This fund was administered by the botany department until 2014, when the department merged with zoology to become today's biology department. And each year, the department brings a distinguished plant pathologist to campus to speak to a broad audience on some important aspect of plant ecology. And at this point, I'd like to introduce some members of the Wilson family that are in attendance. Sue Clark, Roger's widow, and Roger's son, Kevin, and his spouse, Susan. Lady here.
Thanks, Melanie. I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. And before I do that, I want to thank all of the co-sponsors of this year's Roger Wilson Lecture. So this includes the Department of Biology, the College of Arts and Sciences, Graduate School, the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability, which is the successor to the Institute for Environmental Science that Roger Wilson was involved in getting started, the W.S. Terrell Herbarium, Project Dragonfly, the Three Valley Conservation Trust, and the Southwest Ohio Woodland Association. And I also want to thank the Hefner Museum of Natural History for taking care of the audio visual and the Zoom link for today's talk. A couple of reminders, tomorrow at 4:15, Dr. Barton will give the biology department seminar. The title for that is From Individuals to Ecosystems, Impacts and Recovery of Arizona Spy Islands Forests After Wildfire. So it'll be in room 218 tomorrow at 4:15. After tonight's talk, we'll have a reception in the foyer, so please stick around and meet the speaker and ask him questions. Little background on Drew Barton. He did his bachelor's degree at Brown University, his master's at University of Florida. And when he was a master's student there, he was on a tropical biology course in Costa Rica that I was on, a graduate student course, and we became friends. We actually discovered we both have a passion for wordplay and puns. Which when you know me, know about that. My food is even worse than me. And despite that, he joined me at the University of Michigan for his Ph.D. program. So we were fellow grad students at Michigan. And when he finished there, he was a postdoc at University of Kentucky, and then a visiting professor at Franklin and Marshall College before joining the University of Maine at Farmington, where he's been ever since and risen through the ranks. He's played a lot of roles there, developing curriculum and co-founding that campus's Sustainable Campus Coalition. Most of his research has been on his recent research on forest responses to changing climate and wildfire in the mountains of the Southwest US. He's the author of the award-winning book, The Changing Nature of the Maine Woods. And he's also the co-author of this book here, Ecology and Recovery of Old Growth Forests in Eastern North America. He's authored over 50 scientific journal articles. This research has been supported by grants from NASA, National Park Service, National Science Foundation, and others. He co-founded the Michigan National Forest Watch. He serves on several advisory groups for the state of Maine, including the Science Advisory Committee for the Ecological Reserves System. Today, he's going to be speaking to us about welcome to the Pyrocene, making sense of wildfires, question mark. Please welcome Drew Barton.
Well, you know, since I've been here, many people have thanked me for coming. And really, I feel like I need to thank you all for inviting me. It makes me feel like, well, maybe some of my work is worthwhile. But I especially want to thank the Roger Wilson family for creating this and allowing this to happen. It's a wonderful gift to the campus, a wonderful gift to me. So I thank you very much for that. In honor of my long history with Dave Gorchov of punning, I will say that I hope tonight to shed more light and less smoke on your view of fire, and I will be merciful. That will be the last pun that I will inflict on you tonight. This may just be me because I work on wildfires, but yeah, it kind of seems a little bit like the world is on fire. Next year, there's another round. Every year, there seems to be something. There's California wildfires, and then it's the Canadian wildfires, and then it's the California wildfires again, et cetera, and the wildfires in Australia, et cetera. And my goal tonight is to try to help you a little bit with making sense out of this new era of wildfires, or as Stephen Pine, the fire historian, calls it, the onset of the Pyrocene. See if I can get this to work properly. In the first part of this talk, my goal is to convince you that the Earth is a fire planet and that humans are a fire species. Stephen Pine wrote that Earth is a fire planet, the only one we know of. Earth has fire because it has life. Life created the oxygen fire needs. Life created and arranges the fuel it requires. Even the chemistry of fire is a biochemistry. Fire takes apart what photosynthesis puts together. As long as terrestrial life has existed, so does fire. Here are a couple of examples of early kind of remnants of vegetation that has been burned, that has been fossilized. And the first record, actually, of fires burning vegetation is from the Silurian, about 420 million years ago. Now, what's interesting is that two things had to happen on the Earth for the Earth to become a fire planet. This is a graph, millions of years. As you can see, it goes back a billion years.
and on the vertical axis is percent oxygen in the atmosphere. And just pay attention mainly to that blue line. The first thing that had to happen is that photosynthesis had to be invented. And that happened about 2.5 billion years ago. Before that time, there was not much oxygen in the atmosphere at all. Not enough oxygen for fires to burn. Fires need a lot of oxygen. About 15% oxygen in the atmosphere is necessary for fires to actually burn. The second thing that had to happen is that life, and in particular, vegetation, had to come onto land. By the way, the oxygen level of 15% happened between 400 and 450 million years ago. And vegetation, plants, colonized land about 400 to 450 million years ago as well. So around 420 million years ago, apparently, these two things came together and created the fire. Oh, actually, there's one other thing I do want to show you here. There are all kinds of interesting things. I could have added more, but I want you to take a look at that last peak there, where it says lots of fires and plants adapt. So this was a period about 100 million years ago during the Cretaceous, when there was a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, there was a lot of fire, and this is the beginning of the time when plants, at least there's evidence of plants adapting to this new fiery world about 100 million years ago. Let's explore that initiation of the impact of fire on the evolution of plants just a little bit. So this shows the idea that fire drives plant evolution. Let's take a look first over here on the right side. And if you look at the top, row here, you see these plants are resprouting. What's happened there is that the top part of the plant has been killed, or at least kind of killed, if you will, and then they've resprouted. Not all plants can do this. So, but these plants resprout either from the base or from the trunk itself or all over the plant as well. So this is a really important adaptation for dealing with fire. When fire comes in, kills the top of the plant, but they still survive under the ground or somewhere in the trunk and they resprout. If we move down, these yellow flowers are an example of fire-stimulated flowering. Over on the left, I believe. And so this is an example of a really important adaptation of trees to fire, and that is thick bark. Thick bark insulates the very sensitive cambial layer, which allows trees to grow in the lateral direction. And it insulates them from the high temperatures that are generated by fire. Now, if we continue moving down, we notice that these trees have these cones that appear to be sort of sealed shut, and they are indeed. These are called serotinous cones, and they mature, they stay on the plant, they're sealed shut by resin on the plant, and it takes the high temperatures generated by fire to melt that resin, open them up, the fire goes through, the seeds fly into the air, they fall to the ground, they germinate and create a new stand of that species. So this is serotin. Now, if we look to the left, this is a pretty cool graph over here. These are genera, of course the word genera is the plural of genus, and some families of plants. And then they correlate with the time of the evolution of these plant adaptations to fire. So for example, this horizontal rectangle right there is for thick bark that evolved first in pines in the northern hemisphere. These green ones are for fire-stimulated germination. Yep, some plants do that. And then these blue ones are for serotiny, et cetera, et cetera. But this shows that by about 100 million years ago, fire began to shape the biota of the earth, and in particular plants, but animals as well, began to shape, what they looked like, what their physiology was like, et cetera. So indeed, by 100 million years ago, fire is becoming as important a factor on the earth as the air, as water, as light, et cetera. Now, humans eventually began to exploit fire, of course, for a wide range of uses, and many archaeologists feel like that fire is one of the big three that sort of, were important in the development of human civilization, along with hard technology and language as well. Fire is so important to human beings that every society, every culture in the world has a story about
where fire came from. So for example, there's in Greek mythology, the Titan Prometheus stole fire and gave it to people. The San people, Manus stole fire from ostrich and gave it to people. The Cherokee, Grandma Spider took and gave fire to people. Here's just sort of an incomplete list of all the roles of fire in human civilization. I'm not going to read them all, but here are a couple: warmth and promoting the tree seed crops, maintaining transportation highways, warfare, etc. Now, Stephen Pine has argued that there are two narratives that have dominated human consciousness for some time now. There is the primeval narrative about fire, and that is fire as a companion on our journey as stewards of the earth. And then there is the opposing narrative, and that is the Promethean fire, and that is fire as technological power, as a disruptor in defiance of existing order. He's gone further and identified three eras of fire, starting during the Silurian. So he calls these first fire, second fire, and third fire. First fire was the period when fire began to burn organic matter in landscapes, lit mainly by lightning, and ecologically constrained by limits. Second fire is when humans grab the torch, domesticate burning, expand the domain of fire, but it's still ecologically constrained. And then third fire is the period, especially beginning in the Industrial Revolution, where humans began to burn lithic landscapes. And what he means by this is they began to burn fossil fuels, and they burned these in human vessels. They tried to remove fire from landscapes and move fire into these vessels like factories and vehicles and homes. And third fire forgoes ecological limits and deranges ecosystems, according to Stephen Pine. And in fact, he says that it has done two things in particular that you all are probably familiar with. Number one, of course, is climate change. So it deranges the climate, but also it brought about the exclusion and the suppression of fire. And he argues that this third fire is now leading to what he has termed the Pyrocene. So this is the age of fire. So he says not only is this the Anthropocene, or the age of humans, but it is also a time of fire, will increasingly become a planet of fire and an age of fire as well. So my goal in the rest of this talk is to try to help you make sense out of the Pyrocene and why this is happening, and a little bit at the end, like what we can do about it. So just more specifically, I'm going to start by trying to give you sort of a short course in fire science. And then I'm going to try to apply that to three sets of fires in California and in Canada and in the Southwest. And then I don't want everybody to go home all depressed. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit about like what we can do. I won't spend a lot of time, but I want to mention a little bit of some of the recent research that I'm doing with a big team of people. So let's start with this short course on fire science. Maybe I don't need to convince you of this, but here is an image that shows you, wow, there are a lot of wildfires. So these are large wildfires that have been recorded in the United States just in the year 2024. There are a lot of wildfires indeed. So let me start with some definitions. I'll drop down right here to wildfire. So I'm going to use that word a lot. I've already used it some. So by wildfire, we mean an unplanned, uncontrolled fire burning live and dead vegetative fuels. Now, I'm going to also use the word megafire. A megafire is a big, huge fire. And sort of the definition of it is, this is a fire that's greater than 100,000 acres. That's a really big fire indeed. And as you will see, there have been a lot of those kinds of fires. A prescribed fire is an intentionally set fire that's with goals of managing vegetation, reducing wildfire risk, promoting ecosystem health. Cultural fire is similar, but usually what we're talking about here is a fire intentionally set by indigenous people for ecological or subsistence or cultural or spiritual purposes. I'm going to also use the word fuel a lot in this talk. And by fuel, I just mean stuff that burns. And in the case of these wildland fires, I'm talking about live stuff and dead stuff. I'll give you more details on that in just a moment. Okay, so what are the requirements for fire? there are 3 requirements for any kind of fire to burn, and they're up there. And let me describe them in some detail, and I'll go one by one. So the first one is there has to be enough oxygen, as I've already told you. And as I also have already told you, this was originally produced by photosynthetic organisms that released oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis and built up oxygen in the atmosphere. Number 2, there's got to be fuel to burn. And these fuels can be live, as I mentioned. So that means like trees and shrubs and grasses. I mean, I suppose we can include animals in there, but I usually try not to think about that in particular. And I sort of focus on the plants. So these are living plants that will burn. And then they can be dead. And dead fuels can be little twigs, so they can be fine, or they can be coarse. And that would be like logs. They can also be like leaves and things on the ground, and they can be organic matter even in the soil as well. And then third, there has to be a spark. There has to be heat and a spark to get this started. And during first fire, this was mainly lightning. And with the advent of second fire, humans joined this equation. We can divide this further into accident or arson or the cultural or prescribed fires. Now, what all that says up there is that it's not like fire is like this thing that's imposed on humans and on civilization in any sense, that people are part of this equation. So there is a really important sociological element to this. We have to always think about people when we talk about fire and when we talk about the Pyrocene. I want to explore that just a little bit more here. So, and there's a statement at the top that I think is kind of a little compelling, maybe for me as a fire ecologist, and that is that humans have expanded the fire niche. Obviously, they did that during second fire, but I want to take this a little bit further to sort of modern times. So if you look at the number of wildfires in the United States, 84% of them are started by humans. And I'm talking about wildfires, not prescribed fires, not cultural fires, but wildfires. 84% of them. And 44% of the area that's burned in wildfires is attributable to humans as well. But that's not evenly distributed across the United States. So the red areas are places where there are more human ignitions, the blue areas where there are more lightning ignitions. Yeah, maybe this is not that surprising, I guess. Like you see a lot in the Southeast, for example, and you see a lot in California, and you see a little bit here along the Eastern Seaboard, and a little bit in the upper Midwest. And in part, that's like there are a lot of people there. So there are a lot of people to start fires accidentally or on purpose. So kind of interesting, but I particularly like this graph. So this graph shows on the horizontal axis months, January, of course, on the left, December on the far right. And on the vertical axis, this is the number of fires. Red is human ignited, and blue is lightning ignited. If you can just make the red go away for a second in your brain and just look at the blue for just a second, you can see that lightning fires typically, are concentrated in late spring and especially during the summer, and then in the early fall as well. So they're constrained. They're ecologically constrained somewhat. Whereas if you look at the red now, human fires occur anytime. So this is a great example of humans expanding the fire niche in the world. Okay, so let's imagine that a spark starts a fire. What determines the behavior of the fire? What determines whether it burns on the surface or it burns into the crown? What determines how big it is, how hot it is, how much damage it does to vegetation, which, by the way, is called fire severity. Fire intensity is a release of heat. Fire severity is damage to vegetation specifically. So what determines the behavior of the fire? These are the 3 things that determine behavior of the fire. So windier conditions, hotter conditions, drier conditions. I mean, this all I'm sure makes sense to you. So hotter, drier weather, et cetera, cause bigger fires, hotter fires, et cetera. For fuels, more continuous fuels, drier fuels, more fuel, bigger fires. And then one thing you might not have thought very much about, but actually steeper slopes and places that are less rocky are more continuous fuels. So you can see there's a little overlap in these 3 elements here. So also create bigger, hotter fires that move faster. I'm not really going to talk about topography anymore in this talk. I will focus a lot of attention on weather and especially climate, and especially aspects of climate that have changed, climate change, in other words. And I'll talk a lot about fuels as well and how those have changed over time. All right, so here are sort of to condense some of that down, like in order for a spark to catch and spread into a fire, it has to be dry enough for the fire to actually catch in the first place. And then there has to be enough continuous fuel for fire to burn and for it to spread. In other words, there has to be enough dry, continuous fuel for it to catch and for it to spread. Now, this occurs in a lot of places around the world, but not everywhere. Let me try to help you make sense out of that. Like, and a lot of this is, again, sort of common sense. And that is, if we look at moisture from dry to moist, and this is just fire incidents, over on the far left, these are places that are really dry, like deserts, for example, and there's not enough moisture to grow fuel. So there's not enough fuel for a fire that starts for it to spread at all. Over on the there are some exceptions to that these days, which I don't have time to go into. Over on the far right, these are places that are too wet. There's plenty of fuel there to burn, but it's too wet for those fires to catch and for them to spread. And we're talking about places like tropical forests, tropical rainforests in particular. Of course, there are exceptions today, again, that I don't have time to really go into. But all these other places, they have enough moisture to grow enough fuel for a fire to spread, and they are dry. Some of them are dry for only a portion of the year during the so-called dry season. And so they're dry enough for a spark to catch and for it to spread. Let's see how this plays out across the world. So this shows the incidence of fires across the world. The darker the color, the more fires there are. And even the light areas, it doesn't mean that there are no fires at all. It just means there are far fewer fires than in other places. And there again, it just tells us again that wildfires are really common across the world, and the places where they're not very common are too wet or there's insufficient fuel for them to really burn. I thought you might like to see this fire hazard map of the United States. I find this sort of fascinating. I'm always trying to look and see places I've been or places that I've lived. And what adds up to fire hazard? It depends on the kind of vegetation that's there. It depends on the nature of the fuels that are there, and it depends on the climate that is there in particular. Now, so you can see that it's places in the West primarily that have high wildfire hazard, but Florida has very high wildfire hazard for a variety of reasons. Lots of lightning. It tends to be dry, sandy soils, very hot, a lot of evaporation and drying, et cetera. And then parts of the Southeast also have some wildfire hazard. And there's some interesting little outliers here, like New Jersey and the Hudson River Valley. These are places where glaciers, when they retreated, dumped a lot of sand on those places. So those soils dry out readily. So they tend to be somewhat fire prone. New Jersey pine barrens, for example, right there. Okay, so fire all over the place, but fires differ. Fires are really different from one place to another. And we describe these differences in fire with what are called, the term is fire regimes. Fire regimes are typical patterns of fire that occur over long periods of time in some place. Now, we're kind of talking about typical patterns of fires that occur when they're not too disrupted by humans. So in other words, we're often maybe talking about colonization or things like that. So there are lots of characteristics that can make up fire regimes. So for example, there could be, well, what kind of fire usually burns there? Does it burn on the surface? Does it burn into the crown? What is the frequency of fires that occur there? What's the intensity of the fires? That's heat release. And the severity, which is damage to the vegetation. What is typical of these areas? The size of the fires, what's the seasonality of the fires? Obviously, I'm not going to focus on all of these. I want to focus on 3 of them in particular. And that is that we can sort of divide the types of fires into surface fires that burn on the ground primarily, and crown fires that burn up into the crown. But some other things go along with these two fire regimes, which I've shown right here. So if you look over on the left side, the surface fire regimes tend to be low severity, and they tend to occur frequently. So under natural conditions, shall we say, what typically happens is that these places are dry enough so that fires occur pretty frequently. Because fires occur frequently, they thin out and reduce fuel loads and keep fuel loads low so that when the next fire occurs, it's at low severity. The other thing is that trees that occur in these kinds of places like longleaf pine, ponderosa pine, they tend to drop their lower branches so that these fires have a lot of trouble climbing from the surface up into the crown. Most trees would prefer for a fire not to burn in their crown, because that is where trees are very, very vulnerable. So all those three things kind of go together in what we might call frequent surface fire regimes. Now on the right is a different set of characteristics of these fire regimes. So crown fires kill trees and they kill shrubs. And so these are, by definition, really high severity. We often call them stand replacing fires. That is, they kill off a stand and then a new one comes and replaces it. Frequency varies a lot. So for forests, like Canadian boreal forests, for example, or high elevation Rocky Mountain spruce fir forests, these burn infrequently. And that's because they're pretty moist. And it takes a really dry year for it to catch and spread and actually burn. And when it does burn, there's so much fuel that it is really high severity and it kills a lot. And then it takes a while for the fuel to build back up. Now, a place like California chaparral is very, very different, burns differently, and crown fires, high severity, but that happens like every 10 to 20 years or so, whereas a place like boreal forest every 50 to 100 years. But in general, this is a good contrast between typical surface fire regime and crown fire regime. Now, not surprisingly, plants that persist in these places have adaptations to thrive despite the presence of fire. So in surface fire regimes, you typically find trees that have a couple of characteristics that are really, really common. One is thick bark to protect them, because they can survive fire if they have thick bark, protects them from the high temperatures generated by fire. And again, as I mentioned before, they tend to drop their lower branches, which is called self-pruning, so that those fires stay on the ground. This is characteristic of large swath, big areas in the western United States, like ponderosa pine, and also pine forest in the southeastern United States as well. Now, at the other extreme, it's a little, you can't it's not a very good strategy to try to resist fires in a crown fire regime, because if fire gets up into the crown, it's gonna kill most trees. So instead of being resistant to fires, most trees and shrubs are resilient to fires. And they do this by having serotinous cones that stay shut until the fire comes through again. It opens up, the seeds fall to the ground again. As I mentioned before, they germinate and up comes a new stand. Or they have the ability to resprout from their roots because the tree continues to live under the ground, or they have fire-stimulated seed germination, etc. So this is typical, for example, of lodgepole pine that occurs all over, like the Rockies and Montana and areas like that. Yellowstone, oaks in the West, boreal forests in Canada, California chaparral are all crown fire regimes that have these adaptations for continuing to persist despite the presence of these crown fires. Just to kind of, round out the story, of course, there are places that don't burn very much at all, and these tend to have fire-sensitive species. Okay, that's my short course in fire science. Let's now apply these to three sets of wildfires. Let's start with California wildfires. The 2024 fire season in California was actually not bad at all. Only about 1 million acres burned. That's about 1% of California. And part of the reason is that the winter of 2023 and the winter of 2024 were really wet. Really, really wet. So it was high moisture levels, so not that much burning. But, and let me actually compare that to the year 2020. So there's 2024 down there. This is number of acres that burned in California only. And this is from the 1980s up to 2024. There's 2024. There is 2020. 4 million acres burned. 4.3% of California burned in the year 2020. That is quite remarkable. That was unprecedented. But what happened in 2024 is by summer, things really dried out. Now, that's typical of California. Like summer is the dry season, but it was really dry and it was really hot. And the fall was really dry and really hot. So by January of 2025, California was primed to have some really big, dangerous wildfires. And of course, we know that they happen. This is just some images from the Palisades fire. And so this big fire, that's one of several of the really big fires in the LA Basin area. Over here is the footprint of the fire right down there. This is Los Angeles right over here. Really amazing. And these red kind of squares are for structures that actually were pretty much destroyed. And this shows a community that was totally wiped out completely. And there are lots of photos that are like this. This was quite a devastating fire. It burned for 24 days, burned about 24,000 acres, 12 people were killed, 6,800 structures were destroyed in that fire. So the question is, what happened? Well, here's what happened, and that is that we had the wet winters of 2023 and 2024, and those wet winters grew a lot of vegetation. Like the plants like just took off and created all of this new live fuels. And then what happened is in the summer and fall of 2024, it was really hot and really dry, and it killed much of that new vegetation, producing a tremendous amount of fine, dry, dead fuels on the ground. And then add humans to the equation, fireworks and electric lines. There are evidence that fireworks started one fire, electric lines perhaps started another fire, and then you add very, very windy conditions, and boom, you have these big, deadly wildfires. So here are the beginning of sort of a theme of my talk, and that these kinds of things, like these wet winters and then these really dry conditions and the presence of humans and really windy conditions, all contributed to those unprecedented fires. By the way, climate change is responsible. It's not like these conditions, something like this, never occur, but climate change is forcing these conditions and amplifying these conditions so that they're much worse than they generally would be. Now, there are a couple other aspects here that I do want to emphasize. And one of them, I love this term, by the way. Yeah, it's a great term, is that this alternation of like wet periods followed by dry periods. So this is a new theme in fire science. And what fire scientists are finding out is that this alternating wet, dry, which has been termed hydrological whiplash, turns out to be really, really important in driving fires. The problem is that there's really strong evidence now that the warmer the air is, the more we get hydrological whiplash. And the projections are that in the future we'll have even more hydrological whiplash. So the problem is this. Again, let me repeat what I said earlier. You have these wet winters, lots of growth of plants, and then you have really dry conditions. They die, they create all these fine fuels, and then there's a spark, and then windy conditions, and boom, you've got an inferno because of that. So this is going to be a theme that I'll continue through this talk. One other thing I do want to mention is that mainly what burned is chaparral vegetation. Remember, chaparral vegetation actually typically burns through crown fires and burns frequently. So the vegetation in that area naturally would burn pretty frequently, but climate change is pushing it to burn hotter and more frequently and more damage and to spread into communities. So there is a strong climate signal in what is happening and what is creating the pyrocene. Really what I'm trying to do here is give you case studies that will help us explain the bigger picture of burning across the world. And this is a great case study of how climate change is pushing us into the pyrocene. Okay, on to Canada. summer of 2023 Canadian wildfires. Remember, like all of us gasped at 4 million acres burning in California in 2020. Well, 38 million acres burned in Canada during the summer of 2023. That's astounding. I don't have time to go through all this, but this is really powerful. So this kind of shows you like where the fires occurred, when the fires occurred. They started in April, they burned all the way into September, and like how many people had to evacuate, how many acres were burned. And it's a really powerful statement about what it means to have wildfires all over the place. And there we have it. So this goes from the 1980s to 2023. This is millions of hectares. And you can see that the summer of 2023 was unprecedented, at least in like the last half a century. The other thing it shows is these different colors are for the different regions of Canada. And then they're repeated in these bars. This wasn't a fire just in one part of Canada. This was all over Canada. So what was it that drove these wildfires? It's going to sound kind of familiar, but I'm going to add a new wrinkle and a new term for you on this. So this is pretty cool. This is temperature, precipitation, and vapor pressure deficit. What is vapor pressure deficit? That sounds like a word someone created to make it sound really technical, you know, vapor pressure deficit. Really what it means is vapor pressure deficit is the sucking power of the air, the capacity of the air to suck water out of live plants and dead fuels as well. The higher the vapor pressure deficit, the higher the capacity of the air to suck water out of whatever is around it. Now, the problem is that the higher the air temperature, the higher the vapor pressure deficit. And the other problem is that projections for the future as things continue to warm is that vapor pressure deficit and sucking power of the air are projected also to increase over time. But let me help you make sense out of this figure here. What they did is they took 84 years from 1940 to 2023. They took the mean or average temperature for each of the years, the average precipitation for each of the year, and the average for the whole year for vapor pressure deficit. And then they asked the question, well, how did 2023 rank among those 84 years? And a really dark red color means it was number one. You know, it was number one. So like right there, that was, and you can see that this was one of the hottest years on record. Globally, this was the hottest year on record across the entire globe. And even these yellow colors mean it was like in the top 10 out of 84 years. And so it was a really dry year in terms of precipitation. But even if it hadn't been that, even if they had gotten more precipitation, this vapor pressure deficit still would have dried out all those fuels. And so this shows that the sucking power of the air, because it was so hot, was one of, you know, sort of record kind of levels for that year. So it's these three things then that led to that terrible summer of 2023 wildfire season. Again, high temperature, low precipitation, and high vapor pressure deficit. And this is being repeated across the world. Now, let's finally turn to the last example, and these are Southwest USA mega fires. Remember what mega fires are? How many acres? 100,000 acres at least, especially in dryland conifer forests, which makes up large portions of the forest area of the Southwest. And there's a lot of forests in the Southwest. We think of it as deserts. But if you drive from Phoenix to Flagstaff, Arizona, you will come up out of the desert and you will drive for miles and miles and tens and hundreds of miles through forest land, in particular ponderosa pine forests. So let's take a look. So this shows for the entire West. For over the last half a century, you can see that the number of large wildfires has increased across the West. This includes the area that's burned. This is true also just for the Southwest, and it's also true for the dryland coniferous forests like ponderosa pine throughout the Southwest. Now, not only are there more wildfires in the Southwest, but the wildfires the fires have changed from historical times. By historical times, I mean before Euro-American colonization of those areas. So what's happened these days, the fires are bigger, they're hotter, and they burn at hotter severity as well. This is just a little sample of megafires that have occurred in the Southwest, in Arizona and New Mexico, specifically since 1994. There are a lot of these. I mean, look at the acreage on these are hectares. So this is about 250,000 acres there. I have boxes around two of the fires that I want to just point out. This is the biggest fire in Arizona recorded history. This is about 500,000 acres, 500,000 acres. That one fire, the Wallow fire that burned in 2011. Another fire that burned in 2011 down here that burned in the Chiricahua Mountains is the Horseshoe 2 fire that burned about 225,000 acres. The reason I have this one in this little box is because I have been doing research on the aftermath of that fire over the last 15 years or so. And I'll mention a couple more things about that one, so I did want to point it out. Now, that's bad, but one of the problems is that for these dryland coniferous forests, like ponderosa pine, and I will highlight that right there, these are frequent surface fire regimes that burn there. So these places, typically before people colonize these places, they typically burned about every 10 to 20 years from lightning and from Native American burning. And they were low severity fires, they were frequent, etc. At least for California chaparral and Canadian boreal forest, these are places where crown fires occur naturally. And the species are at least adapted to those fires. That's not true of these coniferous forests down in the Southwest. These are adapted to low severity fires and not adapted to the high severity fires. The high severity fires kill them because you can only survive so much if a fire gets up into the crown. And one of the problems that's happening is that more and more areas that are subject to these big, high severity, very hot megafires, we have a conversion of forest land to non-forest land. Here's an example from my research. Whoops, sorry. Down in the Chiricahua Mountains, this is before fire, this is a Madrean pine oak forest, and this is after fire. This is about 10 years post-fire. No evidence of any pines coming back in this place after 10 years. And here are some other examples of places across the western United States. So there's real concern about these megafires driving these forests to non-forest oak shrublands and even grassland areas, and losing some of the ecosystem services, the rich ecosystem services that are associated with complex forest land. So what is driving this? Well, this is going to get really familiar, and I won't spend too much time on this. So here are some data from my research in the Chiricahua Mountains, just showing what's becoming very familiar to you now. So this shows from 1980 up to about 2021, I think. This is temperature in the Chiricahuas, and this is Palmer Drought Severity Index. And that is a measure of sort of the soil moisture stress, so the dryness of soil and what is available to vegetation. And you can see, so up here is moister and down here is drier. And you can see things are getting drier and drier and drier. In fact, they got so dry that that period around in 2021 was the driest period in the last 1,200 years. That is remarkable. The driest period in the last 1,200 years. The other thing is there's that hydrological whiplash again. And there's strong evidence for that particular fire. There, 2011, right there is the Horseshoe 2 fire and the Wallow fire, the year 2011. And notice that the year before that was not particularly dry at all. It was wet enough to actually create a lot of fine fuels, et cetera, that then dried out. And then they became, ready to burn. And then along comes really hot, really dry conditions, a spark, and then suddenly you have a fire that burned pretty much 2/3 of that mountain range in one fire over a month and a half. So that's one factor. Now there's another factor that I've sort of ignored somewhat that you might sort of be thinking, well, you haven't talked about fire suppression very much here. So fire suppression turns out to be really, really important in these places as well. So this is what these ponderosa pine forests are supposed to look like. This is what they looked like 150 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. This is what they look like today. And that's because of the policy of putting out fires and also the introduction of livestock that removed the fine fuels, and it made it hard for fires 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 75 years ago to actually start and actually spread. Here is another image of fire suppression. This is 1896 here, same place. This is the year 2000. So that is the result of fire suppression. And that is a considerable buildup of fuels, both live fuels and dead fuels. So if we go back to this fire behavior triangle then, remember I said windier, hotter, drier conditions, more continuous fuels, drier fuels, more fuel. At least for the Southwest and for the mega fire, for the story here, fire suppression is resulting in more continuous fuels and it's more fuel as well. Climate change is resulting in windier conditions and hotter conditions and drier conditions and hydrological whiplash as well. And it's also drawing out the fuels as well. And so it is these two factors, climate change and fire suppression, that is in particular driving these southwestern mega fires. Now you might ask, well, what about fire suppression in Canada, boreal forest, and in those California wildfires? Now, suppression is playing a little bit of a role there, but not nearly as much a role as it's playing in ponderosa pine and forests that are like that across the Southwest and really across large portions of the West in general. All right, can we actually do anything about this, or should we just kind of give up? Well, you know, when there's ecosystem changes, managers can take three different approaches. They can resist the changes with management actions so that they can maintain ecosystem processes and functions and ecosystem services, et cetera. Or going to the far right, they can direct the changes. They can accept that, you know, well, we can't change everything, but maybe we could direct this to maintain some of these services, or they can just accept the changes. Perhaps they could conclude that, you know what, this new vegetation is better adapted to the new fire regime. We're just going to let this dominate. So I want to talk about this, and in particular about frequent surface fire regimes and what forests and what we actually might be able to do to maintain and to resist what is happening. And in particular, the question is, can we reverse? I mean, look, I can't go out into a forest and reverse the effects of climate change very well, although you'll see maybe a little bit. But can we reverse the effects of fire suppression in these frequent surface fire forests, which again, ponderosa pine is the most widespread forest type in the Western United States. So I'm not talking about like just a little bit of area in Arizona. This is the most widespread forest type in all of Western United States. So there are two things that maybe we can do by restoring the natural densities of these forests. In other words, taking these, as it's called, densified forests. That's actually a term that's being used in the literature. Densification. I hate that word, but it is being used. But can we take these really dense forests and can we turn them back into the sort of structure they had during more, we'll just call it more natural times? And in particular, will that reduce catastrophic high severity fire? And then secondly, can we actually increase drought resilience by doing that? Let's take a look at the first one. So let me help you interpret that. I decided not to show you the data. The data are very convincing, but it's like, whoa, it would take a long time to describe the data. So what this shows is this column is before wildfire, this column is during wildfire, this column is after wildfire. And what they're doing here is depicting what the results of a review using what is called a meta-analysis of something like 50 experiments across the southwestern United States in trying to see if we can reduce the densities of these forests, can we reduce the severity of subsequent wildfires. That is kind of what they're reviewing and depicting here. So again, before wildfire, during, and after. This is for untreated or controls. This is for thinning the forests, so mechanically thinning them. This is for doing prescribed fire. This is doing thinning and prescribed fire. I have red boxes around these because let's just focus on the untreated and the thin and prescribed burning. And so the idea is that if we do nothing, that we're going to get a lot of this. We're going to get a lot of high severity fire where everything is wiped out entirely. And maybe it will be transformed into oak shrublands or grasslands. But if we can thin and prescribe burn, return them to natural densities, that this is what we generally find. And the evidence is really strong for this. It's really strong that this actually works to reduce high severity fire. This is just one little case study, which I thought was kind of interesting that I wanted to include here. So this is no treatment. You can see everything died there. This is thinning. Well, it helped a little bit, but when you combine thinning and prescribed fire, you actually maintain a forest canopy, which is really interesting. Now, let me end by telling you just a little bit about a new project that I'm involved in. This is up on the Colorado Plateau near Flagstaff, actually, a place called Chimney Springs, ponderosa pine. And the question is, well, if we thin the forest, will this actually help with drought resilience? Here's the logic of that. Imagine if you have a bowl with, you're drinking something out of a bowl, and you've got 20 straws and 20 people who are sucking on the straws. Well, you're going to deplete that, whatever liquid that is, very, very quickly. You can just choose your favorite liquid that might be in that bowl. And so 20 straws, deplete it really fast. What if you only had 10 straws? Where you're going to deplete it more slowly. That's the logic. But of course, ecosystems are really complex. So that's got to be a real simplification. So we actually have to carry out experiments to see whether that actually is borne out or not. And that is exactly what we're trying to do. So we're taking advantage of a remarkable experiment that is going on across the entire state of Arizona. In fact, this is happening all over the West. And what they are doing is they are thinning and prescribed burning 3.5 million hectares. That's like 9 million acres or something like that across the state of Arizona in four different national forests. And so it's called the 4FRI Initiative, for Forest Restoration Initiative, and they are doing some combination of mechanical thinning and prescribed burning in these places. So we've taken advantage of this, a place where they have thinned, they have not burned, but they have thinned. And so this was in 2017. This is before thinning. This was after thinning. Again, this is near Flagstaff, Arizona. Lots of teammates. I'm only a small part of this project. And we have soil moisture sensors, 300 soil moisture sensors at multiple depths to sort of look at, well, what are the impacts on soil moisture in these places? The other thing we're doing is we have these what are called sap flow sensors that plug into trees, and they're monitoring the movement of water through the trees. We have these little weather stations that are monitoring the movement of water from the ground and ground vegetation into the air. And if you add that plus that, you get what is called evapotranspiration. And that is the combination of water that is transpiring out the stomates from trees, plus the water that is evaporating from the ground and from the ground vegetation and is transpiring through the ground vegetation. Now, the other thing we're doing that I'm really not going to talk about here is one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to validate a new instrument that is on the space station called EcoStress that is trying to measure evapotranspiration remotely so that we can measure this across vast land areas. And so we're measuring evapotranspiration just like EcoStress is trying to estimate evapotranspiration. We're trying to see whether we can validate whether it works or not. And so, but I'm not going to talk about that part. I really only want to tell you the results right now. Happy to talk about EcoStress afterwards. But I want to show you the impact of thinning on water availability and water balance and water movement through these ecosystems. Okay, so here are some data. We're just now getting some data. And so this shows April, the growing season, so April through July, up into the beginning of the monsoon rainy season. And just don't worry about what is on specifically on this vertical axis, but up is moisture and down is drier. This is for the thin stands and this is for the unthin stands. And so what this shows you is that, wow, there's a lot more water when you thin. It creates a lot more water in the soil when you thin these stands. Now, this is a little more complicated, so bear with me here. This is what the trees are experiencing in the thinned and unthinned stand. Let's start at the top here. So this shows tree water use, how much water these trees are actually moving through themselves. This is from April of 2023 all the way to the fall of 2023. We're continuing. This is 3-4 year project here. And so the green is for the thin stands and the blue is for the unthin stands. And you can see that trees in the thin stands have a lot more water that's available and they're using a lot more water than are the trees in the unthin stand. And the same thing is shown down here. This just shows the mean, and I think that's standard error, 95% confidence intervals. This shows mean tree water use. And again, the thin stands, the trees in the thin stands have a lot more water available to them. And there are lots of other results from other kinds of measurements with other instruments. So for example, the needles are less water stressed, the needles have higher water content, they're more understory plants, and there's more snowpack in the thin stands. Okay, one of the things we're trying to do now is extrapolate these results eventually across the whole 4-fry experiment. So the idea is, can we actually get an estimate of how much water will be saved across these 9 million acres that are being thinned and burned? I won't go into detail on that, but it's very ambitious. I'm a little skeptical, but it's an interesting sort of exercise, and that is, how much water can you actually save? How much of that water might go and be available to communities as well? Finally, I'll just mention this, and that is that there are some places where they're trying just to let the forest burn and see what happens. So there's this really cool experiment going on in Yosemite. It's been going on since 1972. They can do it because the fire, because of the topography, can't like get out of this basin. It's pretty large. You can see right there, there it is in Yosemite. So it takes up a large area. They've had a total let burn policy since 1972. This is not going to work everywhere. So, I'm not saying that this is the solution. There are places where this will not work, but there are places where it could work. What they found is that 25% reduced forest cover, increased biodiversity, more water, more snowpack. And so this is promising, at least, that maybe in some places we can just let the forest burn and see what happens. Okay, so what this tells us is that frequent surface fire forests, maybe we have a chance to actually resist what is happening and restore some of the densities of these forests back to their sort of natural conditions, so that fires that come in subsequently are lower severity, and so that they're more resilient to, increasing aridity in these places. Other places may be more complicated. So, and again, I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. So here are the conclusions. Let me try to sum up in just a few words. So obviously, curbing emissions and warming is paramount. That's a really tall order, especially these days. But nevertheless, obviously, that is part of what is happening and what is driving us into the Pyrocene. But there are other things that I think are probably more feasible. I'm not giving up on curbing emissions by any means, but I only have so much control over that. Active management can promote fire and drought resilience, but I think the bottom line here is that we have to embrace more second fire and less third fire. We have to embrace a primeval. That is, that fire is a tool that we can use as stewards of the earth and stewards of fire in general, rather than this Promethean approach to fire. And with that, I think I'll leave it there. And thank you for sticking with me through this entire talk. Anybody have any questions? Well, good. I'll see you later. No, just kidding. questions? Yeah.
From your specialty perspective, presumably logging is different things, but how do you think that will affect?
Yeah, so the problem with that policy is that it is a one-size-fits-all policy. And so there are places, ponderosa pine, where I think it makes sense based on scientific evidence. But there are many other places in national forests where it doesn't make sense at all. There are so many other places where it's not a frequent surface fire regime, and fire suppression has only modified them somewhat, that they are typically, an infrequent stand replacing crown fire sort of regime, and it makes no sense to do logging in those places. So that's the problem, is this one size fits all, and that doesn't work. That's the problem, I think, that I had initially. I was like, oh my gosh, here we go again. Honestly, I'll speak frankly. Like whenever the Forest Service or a government says, we're going to go in, here's good reason for doing logging, often it gets abused and you get a lot more logging than you really need, and you get abuse of that policy, and you get logging in places where they shouldn't be doing logging. Some places we really need to just focus on sequestering carbon and not harvesting them at all. From my perspective, I understand we need wood, and that is an appropriate use of some national forests for sure. But no, logging everywhere, no, not at all. Doesn't work.
Yeah. If you do have logging, and it's like it used to be, when I was a child, I lived in a logging area in the 1950s. And they would just take everything. So what kind of grow back? How does the succession work after that? How long does it take, or will it ever come back?
It depends. Tell me where you grew up, first of all, and I'll include that. Ah, yes. Okay, so you grew up in Humboldt County, California, redwoods and mixed conifers and all kinds of other species as well. And when they would log, they cut everything. And the question is, well, how long does it actually take to come back? And does it ever come back? Some places definitely will come back. The places that struggle to come back are the drier places. And that's what is happening, especially in the Southwest, is that after these big fires, it's so dry and it's so hot now that these pines in particular have a lot of trouble germinating and growing and surviving during those vulnerable first few years. So the drier places are in particular really vulnerable. Probably less so in Humboldt County. I'm not justifying logging by any means, but I think that they will come back eventually.
And it had grown back, the trees weren't as big, but they were a lot of redwoods. I suspect there were a lot of other trees that would have been there, other species that wouldn't have been there without the cutting. So I could see myself, even as a child, that things are coming back and over years or whatever. But then where they farther back into the mountains, and it was just really crazy.
It can take a really long time.
Trees and no trees.
Yeah, it can take a long time. And there is concern. Ecologists that are studying redwoods are very concerned about the future. Because redwoods live in this little sliver. They used to be really wide, and now they're the area where, so their appropriate habitat has shrunk so much. And there's only that area where that has a lot of water from fog, for example, and temperatures are not too high. And so that's changing. And so there's a lot of concern about redwoods. But for me, my gosh, I can't imagine logging 1,000-year-old redwoods that have spent 1,000 years growing and sequestering carbon. They have all this carbon inside of them. They support this complex ecosystem, but hey, that's just me. Other questions? Yeah.
But if the data is showing that brush clearing and controlled burns are 2 thumbs up. What's the biggest obstacle across the board that's stopping us from just employing those? Guidelines?
Excellent question. One is, oh, okay, sorry. So the question is, well, if there's evidence, and we'll just say if there's evidence in some places that you should be doing thinning, brush clearing, you should be doing prescribed fires, what are the obstacles for actually doing that? Number one, people tend not to like their houses to burn down. So this is only in places that are heavily populated, but people also don't like it when there's a lot of smoke in the air, and for good reason, because it's not good for your health. So I was in Portland 3 years ago or something, Portland, Oregon, 3 years ago. My daughter lives there, and boy, the smoke was really quite remarkable. And there were no fires right there, but there were fires out in the Columbia River Gorge and many other places as well. So that is a real obstacle. Some of those can be overcome, and that is you have to be careful when you burn, how close you burn. People, we need much more effort in clearing a safe space around houses and where people live and other buildings in places that are fire prone. By safe space, I mean so that if a fire comes, it's not going to come right up to the house. But the other thing is that there are some times when the smoke clears really well, and there are other times when it doesn't clear well at all. There are weather conditions where the smoke doesn't clear well at all. And so there has to be, and there is, an effort to do this kind of burning in times when it does, when it really does clear. It's kind of amazing to fly into Flagstaff because you look out and you see like prescribed fires, smoke coming from prescribed fires everywhere. And I'm like, talk to, a lot of the team that's working on this is at Northern Arizona University. I'm like, are those prescribed fires? Oh yeah, they're all of those are prescribed fires. And it's like, wow, they are actually burning a lot. And it's pretty remarkable actually to see how much is being burnt. Other questions? Yeah.
Fires came down, and I was just wondering if there's like a reason they smell weird, like not like a campfire.
That's an interesting. Oh, sorry. Question. So he's from Cleveland, Ohio, best city in the United States. Okay, go Browns. Yeah. So, and that he said that some of the smoke from the Canadian wildfires came down, and he thought that it smelled weird. It didn't smell like fire or wood burning. I mean, I have one possible. I don't know the answer. The only thing I can think of is that it's burning a lot of live trees. It's not just burning, it's not just burning dry dead wood, but it's burning live trees. I have no idea. Does anybody have a better explanation? It could be one. Yeah. That's interesting. That actually makes a lot of sense. Yeah, they definitely smell different. Yeah, that's very cool. Huh. Other questions? Yeah.
These might play in the forest composition, so like how the fire behavior might act with different invasive species funding.
Great question. Really great question. So the question is, what might the role of invasive species be in really causing fires, I think is what you're asking. I can give you one example, and that is, remember I said, oh, deserts don't burn. Well, they do now, and they burn because of invasive species that have invasive grasses that are very, very flammable, and they establish en masse so that they form a continuous live fuel, and again, very flammable, and now deserts are burning a lot more than they used to burn. So that's an excellent example there. A little less true in forests as far as I can think, but especially in more shrubland and grassland areas. So it's a good question. I'm not aware of any because of invasive species there, but certainly in the desert regions of like Arizona, what's it called? Buffalo grass and cheatgrass and a couple of others, yeah, are really a problem, and they're really hard to remove, very hard to get rid of. Yeah.
was just wondering if, that soil moisture that you gain from the selective logging.
Mhm.
If cheatgrass is gonna have an effect on that because they're winter annual and they tend to deplete the, the more deep, the water that's held in deeper regions in the soil.
Well, they might, if it actually existed in those forests. It's too cold there for cheatgrass, though. This is at 7,000 feet, so really snowy and a cold climate. So there is no, as far as I know, there's no cheatgrasses, or it's not a problem there, but it's a problem at lower elevations. But you could imagine that there could be an invasive species that could come along from somewhere and play exactly that role. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Yeah.
Are, I guess, proposed, how does the management kind of address that potential for like decreased biodiversity or increased habitat fragmentation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the idea is that when you thin, you still have an intact canopy. So we're talking about, maybe you're taking a third, maybe you're taking a half or something like that. And so I honestly can't really adequately answer that question very well. We did have an opportunity to go out with one of the main planners for 4Fry the last time we were in Arizona, which is really interesting. And it's a really complicated job. And I could tell, like, from that there's so many factors that he and people on his team were considering, but he didn't specifically talk about biodiversity. It is an interesting question. Of course, when they've allowed fires to burn in that area in Yosemite, biodiversity actually went up. So I don't know how, and I'm not aware of any studies looking at the impact on biodiversity. For example, biodiversity of understory plants and biodiversity of insects. I'm not really aware of that. It may be that it increases it because you are restoring more natural conditions, you're opening things up, you're creating more heterogeneity than is present. That's one of the problems, is that these fire suppressed forests are really homogeneous because they're just solid, trees. And so that's a great question, though. And obviously it would be really important to balance all of those factors. I wish I could answer the question a little bit better, but.
So I'm sure more of you have questions for Drew. We've got a reception, I hope, out in the corner, and we'll be doing Drew out there in a minute. So let's thank him again for the.
Thank you. Thank you.